A stolen childhood, a nation's shame. 1944. A year that would be remembered for the horrors of World War II, but also for a tragedy closer to home. A year etched in history for a world at war. As soldiers fought bravely on foreign soil, another kind of battle was being waged within the borders of the United States. But in the small town of Alcolu, South Carolina, another battle raged. It was a battle of justice versus prejudice, innocence versus hatred. It was a battle not fought on distant shores, but in the very heart of America, where the enemy wore not a foreign uniform, but the mask of racial hatred. The enemy was within, lurking in the shadows of segregation and discrimination. This is the story of George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old boy, silenced by the electric chair, his only crime the color of his skin. In a trial that lasted barely a day, with no substantial evidence, George was convicted and sentenced to death. This isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting the ugliness of our past and the uncomfortable truths of our present. The story of George Stinney Jr. is a stark reminder of the deep-seated racial injustices that have plagued our nation. It's a story that needs to be told and retold, whispered in hushed tones and shouted from rooftops until justice, however delayed, finds its voice. We must remember George Stinney Jr., not just as a victim of a flawed system, but as a symbol of the ongoing fight for equality and justice. His story is a call to action, urging us to confront the past and strive for a better future. Beneath the shroud of Jim Crow. To understand George Stinney's fate, we must first understand the world he inhabited. A world where the color of your skin dictated every aspect of your life, from the schools you could attend to the water fountains you could drink from. It was a world suffocating under the weight of Jim Crow, where segregation wasn't just a policy, but a suffocating way of life. The laws were designed to keep Black Americans in a perpetual state of inferiority, ensuring that they remained separate and unequal. Black Americans, even children, were relegated to the shadows, denied basic rights, treated as second-class citizens in their own land. They were forced to navigate a society that viewed them as less than human, where their dreams and aspirations were stifled by systemic racism. Schools were segregated, restaurants were off-limits, and opportunity was a privilege reserved for the white few. Black children attended underfunded schools with outdated materials, while their white counterparts enjoyed better facilities and resources. In this environment, fear and suspicion thrived, poisoning the very fabric of society. The constant threat of violence loomed over Black communities, and any perceived transgression could result in brutal repercussions. Black lives were cheap, easily discarded, and the legal system, far from a sanctuary, often served as an instrument of oppression. The courts were biased, and justice was rarely served for Black individuals. Instead, the legal system was used to reinforce the racial hierarchy, ensuring that Black Americans remained subjugated and powerless. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Black communities found ways to resist and survive. They built strong networks of support, relying on family, church, and community to navigate the harsh realities of segregation. Their resilience and determination laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would eventually challenge and dismantle the Jim Crow system. The accusation whispers in a time of hate. The story begins with a whisper, a rumor that spread like wildfire through the white community of Alcolu. It was a time when fear and suspicion were rampant, and the smallest spark could ignite a blaze of hysteria. Two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 7, were found murdered. Panic gripped the town. The community was in shock, and the demand for justice was immediate and intense. The authorities, desperate for answers, quickly focused their attention on George Stinney. In their haste, they overlooked crucial details and ignored potential leads. The pressure to find a culprit was immense. George, small for his age and known to be quiet, was an easy target. His slight frame and timid demeanor made him seem vulnerable, an easy scapegoat for a community in turmoil. He was seen talking to the girls the day they disappeared, an interaction deemed suspicious simply because of his race. In a town divided by racial lines, this innocent conversation was twisted into something sinister. In the eyes of the white community, fueled by prejudice and fear, George's guilt was a foregone conclusion. The trial was swift and biased, with little regard for fairness or justice. The whispers of hate had grown into a roar, drowning out any voice of reason or compassion. The courtroom was a theater of injustice, where the outcome was decided long before the trial began. George, just 14 years old, faced a hostile jury and a predetermined fate. The evidence was flimsy, the defense inadequate, but none of that mattered in the face of overwhelming prejudice. The community's grief and anger were channeled into a single, tragic focus. George Stinney became a symbol of their fear, a scapegoat for their pain. The whispers in a time of hate had claimed another innocent life, leaving a legacy of sorrow and injustice that would echo through the years. A mockery of justice, 70 days to death. What followed was a travesty of justice, a sham trial that lasted a mere 2 hours. No physical evidence linked George to the crime. No witnesses could place him at the scene. His court-appointed lawyer, a tax commissioner with no prior criminal experience, offered a meager defense. The jury, comprised entirely of white men, deliberated for a mere 10 minutes before returning with a guilty verdict. The sentence: death by electrocution. George Stinney, a child who still had baby teeth, was now the youngest person sentenced to death in 20th century America. The stain of innocence lost. On June 16, 1944, just 70 days after his arrest, George Stinney was led to the electric chair. He was so small that a phone book had to be placed on the seat to allow the electrodes to reach his head. Witnesses described him as terrified, his small frame trembling as the straps were fastened around him. With the flip of a switch, his young life was extinguished. His only crime was being black in a time and place where that was enough to warrant a death sentence. Echoes of injustice, lynching's long shadow. George Stinney's execution wasn't an isolated incident. It was but one tragic chapter in a long and brutal history of racial terror in America. Lynching, a horrific form of vigilante justice, cast a long shadow over the nation, particularly in the South. Black men, women, and children were routinely murdered by mobs, often on the flimsiest of accusations. These acts of violence, fueled by racism and unchecked by law enforcement, served as a tool of terror designed to maintain white supremacy and keep Black Americans living in a state of perpetual fear. A World War I, a home still divided. The irony of George Stinney's execution was not lost on many. At the very moment that Black soldiers were fighting and dying overseas to defend democracy, a 14-year-old boy was being unjustly executed in their own backyard. The hypocrisy was staggering. These soldiers returned home from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific to a country still deeply divided along racial lines. Their sacrifices abroad did little to change the realities of Jim Crow at home. The fight for equality was far from over. Justice deferred. The fight continues. In 2014, 70 years after his execution, George Stinney Jr. was exonerated. A judge vacated his conviction, ruling that he had not received a fair trial. While this posthumous pardon offered a modicum of closure, it could not erase the injustice inflicted upon him. George Stinney's story is a stark reminder that the fight for racial justice in America is far from over. From the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow to the ongoing struggles against police brutality and mass incarceration, the echoes of the past continue to reverberate in the present. Remember, George Stinney, a call to action. As we reflect on the tragic case of George Stinney Jr., let us remember that his story is not just a relic of the past. It is a call to action, a reminder that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing struggle. We must confront the systemic racism that continues to plague our society. We must dismantle the structures of oppression that disproportionately impact communities of color. We must honor the memory of George Stinney and countless others by fighting for a more just and equitable future for all.